What's up, guys?
It's Rowan
and Terry
here from Artismart TV, bringing you another episode of
the HSC Economic Review.
Now, in this episode, we're going to be going through the recent 2021 HSC Economics paper to go through the answers. So we're going to be running through, particularly for the multi-choice and the shorts, what the actual answers were for the multis, what are some of the things you could have done in the shorts to pick up marks, and then we'll also unpack some of the things that you hopefully did for the essays that you might have chosen. Now, before we dive into this, quick update, Terry and I did do, in our last HSC Economics Review video, our predictions for the HSC Economics exam, and super pumped. We did pretty well, if I may say. I mean, I'm just going to claim it actually, well done. We ended up picking 3 out of the 4 short answers. So we had picked exchange rates, environmental sustainability, and micro and inflation as 3 of the topics we thought were likely in the shorts, and they were in this. We got 3 out of 4 short answer questions. When it came to the essays, Terry had thought there'd be a fiscal, I thought there'd be a monetary.
And it turns out there were 2. There were both of them.
There were both.
Yeah.
Which we didn't quite expect, but we did end up picking 2 out of the 4 essays. So overall, I think we did really, really well. I think the other thing was we also had picked a number of other topics that we thought would be in shorts that ended up being in essays. Stuff we thought would be in essays ended up being in shorts. So the stuff that we didn't get right in terms of placement, we got broadly correct in the paper itself, which is really awesome. But enough of
patting yourself on the back.
Yeah, exactly. Enough of that. Let's dive in and actually dig into the answers for the paper, because we've had a bunch of requests come through from students messaging us saying, hey, can you do this video? Clearly they're wanting to know maybe before they get their official results.
Yeah, and before you guys, before we get into the answers, I just want to very publicly state that we are very, very confident in these multi-answers. So I hope that's good news for you in that your answers are the same as our answers. But yeah, we are very confident that these are the correct answers.
Cool. Brilliant. So let's dive in. And what we'll have is we'll probably just link the exam below. I mean, you can go and find it anyway. It's on NESA, right, under the 2021 exam. So we've got question number 1 with what is the role of the World Trade Organization? I think this was a relatively simple one in terms of giving marks away. What's the answer, Terry?
A.
Yep, to resolve trade disputes. Nice and simple. Hopefully you got it right. Great. Number 2, we had a hypothetical economy, small population, wide export base, high per capita income. What are we saying this economy is going to be classified as?
I think the biggest hint was just that they had that high per capita income, and that as a result of that, you should have went straight for B.
Yep, that's right. Which was advanced.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah. Great. What was the third question?
This one was probably the first of 2 questions, which I think were a little bit controversial. And look, if I'm being totally honest, in a normal year, you're going to probably have at least a couple that are a little bit weird. And the fact that we only had 2, I think, Rowan, for me personally, that's a really encouraging, positive sign. So for me, this one was a gift if you did business studies, and it was an absolute nightmare if you didn't. So the answer here, which of the following is not contained in the National Employment Standards? The correct answer should be C, the national minimum wage. But why do you think students would have had a tough time with that one?
Well, I think particularly because when you think of the sort of award system itself, you think of the industrial relations reform. A lot of it is centred around having minimum wages, right? Whether or not it's the national or under specific awards. And so I think it's probably the one that really sits in your mind as like, surely that's got to be under the national employment standards, right? Whereas you might look at it and go, annual leave and public holidays hopefully were 2 that you probably also thought were pretty clear national employment standards. But the one that maybe not so much would have been the requests for flexible working arrangements. Whereas that in fact is, and of course it's been incredibly important over the last couple of years with COVID as well. And so I would imagine a lot of students got this wrong by putting D, where in fact, yes, while we have a national minimum wage, it's not actually one of the 11 national employment standards because it's actually dealt with separately. So yes.
I want to give out a shout out to B as well, because I know some of my own students put B, and I think for them they were not used to just seeing, because it's a little bit vague, they just say public holidays. In the actual employment standards they talk about paid public holidays or the opportunity to refuse work on public holidays. So the fact that they just kind of wrote public holidays, some students may have just felt, they're going to be talking about Christmas Day or something,
And
right?
it's quite funny because I saw this. This was a question that I'd seen, whether or not it was a trial or a past HSC paper a little while back. And it was funny because in the lead up to the exam, I remember, I think maybe the week before, I was doing a similar question to this with some students we were supporting with at Art Smart in our bounce back program. And what was quite interesting is I was like, guys, make sure you go and learn the national employment standards, because if they give you this question, it's going to screw you, right? Like, it's just going to do your head in, because they all sort of sound a little similar, right? They all sort of blur. So anyway, sure enough, it appeared, and I was like, well, I'm glad we covered it, but even then, it's easy. It's an easy one to make a mistake on. Great, let's keep moving. We've got number 4. And so this was a government budget for a deficit, and then there's an unexpected decrease in the level of economic activity. And you needed to then identify what was the likely change in tax revenue and the deficit that results. I think this was a fairly easy one, really. What did you get as the answer here, Terry?
I got A. So tax revenue would fall and the deficit would therefore increase.
Yeah, great, which is your automatic stabilizers at work.
And I think it also is a nice question just because it was really, really topical. So it gave students who might not have necessarily been that into their books just a chance to talk about things that they might have heard their teachers talking about throughout the year.
Yeah.
So a good question.
Great. Then we've got, which of the following reflects deliberate changes in fiscal policy? And so what they're really trying to get you to think about here is the differences between your cyclical and structural components of the budget. And I mean, that sort of gives away the answer here as well.
Yeah.
So the answer in this case was B, right? A deliberate change is not something that is driven by an automatic stabilizer, which would form under the cyclical component.
I want to flag that as a question where a lot of my kids also overthought it.
Yeah,
because
I was going to say, I almost made that mistake as well, where I started going into underlying versus headline, actually.
Yeah. But because if you think about it, right, like when we talk about deliberate changes, obviously that is going to have an impact, right, on the actual balance at the end of the day.
And a deliberate change could be a one-off change as well, right? So I could easily see when I did it, I had to pause and think, headline, no, like I can see why it's not, but I could also see how a deliberate change could, for example, let's say the sale of a government asset, right? Deliberate change causes a headline outcome to be different, right? You could therefore go, great, headline's different. But I think the point is that it doesn't, when we're talking about deliberate changes, it was really wanting you to look at the cyclical versus structural.
And I think that just comes back to this idea that for multiple choice, I think it's actually a bit weird because sometimes some of the really, really strong students, which I'm sure all of you who are watching this video are,
definitely.
Sometimes you guys kind of overthink it, right? You overcook it, and in realistic terms, the test is really trying to often just test the most direct concept attached to it. And so that was definitely, in this case, the structural component.
That's right. I agree. I think, I've seen a lot of students overthink it. And the irony is that they've thought through it in so much more depth and have such a better level of knowledge, but then they get it wrong.
Well, I think we should hashtag scrap multiple choice. Just get rid of it.
Get rid of it. Question number 6, Gini coefficient of a hypothetical economy has changed from 0.2 to 0.3. So I think first to get this right, it's not hard, but you've got to go, well, what's happened to income inequality here? And we can see that it's worsening in this economy, not by a lot, but by a little. What was the answer for this one,
So this
Terry?
one was B, a tax on consumption, and I think this is clearly alluding to, for example, our GST, alluding to the fact that these are regressive taxes and that they do end up proportionally hurting low-income earners more than high-income earners, thus worsening the equality.
That's right. So now question number 7 was one that I thought students may get wrong, right? And again, I think when you sort of go through it, it's like, okay, yes, there is an answer that clearly is correct and there, but there's a couple in there that I think you could easily get a little confused, particularly if with number 5, right, where we talked about the deliberate changes in fiscal policy, right? So here, what's the correct one about automatic stabilizers? And I think just to quickly highlight, if we look at it, A, B, and C are actually not automatic stabilizers. Now, the hard part is when you look at them, they're actually correct in their statements, right? And that's why it gets a little confusing, I think, because you look at it, will increase in MRT, the margin rate to tax, will slow economic growth. But that is a deliberate change in policy. That's a structural change. Equally, an increase in infrastructure spending is a deliberate change, right? A reduction on employment benefits, deliberate change. And so we're sort of left with D, which is taxpayers moving into higher tax brackets, slowing economic growth. And for me, that was a bit of an interesting one because it's not like a great example of an automatic stabilizer, right? And I guess that's where it's not sort of obvious which is why maybe students got it wrong. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
I thought this one was a good, like I teach my kids, like if you're really, really stuck, play the opposite game. So look for the odd one out, and you'll notice that D was indeed the odd one out, because the others were all talking about making some tangible change, whether you're increasing or reducing, whereas D kind of implied that it was a little bit more automatic. But yeah, my thoughts on this is, I think there's also an additional layer of trapping, if you will, at the beginning, where if students just kind of looked at it and just going, oh yeah, marginal income tax and unemployment benefits, that's automatic, exactly. Let's go with that, yeah.
And I agree. When I was doing it, my first run through very quickly, my gut was like, oh, A looks good.
Yeah.
And then I was like, oh, wait a minute, I'm getting tricked here. Awesome. What about A? What was question 8?
Oh, 8. Yeah. Sorry.
I think this was a good one as well, actually.
Yeah, so the correct answer, which of the following would lead to an increase in free trade? The correct answer was C, an increase in size of existing quotas and a decrease in tariffs. Now, I think, Rowan, you definitely got a lot more to say about this one. What was the other option that could
So I think the other option that could have been, and it could still create it, but it's not as correct, I think that's the thing, is B, an increase in export incentives. Well, that's encouraging you to trade. So you could see how that's leading to increased levels of trade, and a decrease in subsidies is clearly a decrease in protection. Yeah. So you can see how B plausibly might be considered correct. Now the reason it's not is because an export incentive is considered a quasi form of protection, right? Like it's a little bit of where you're bending the rules a little bit because you're still artificially giving someone an advantage when it comes to trade, right? You're giving them tax benefits, you're giving them increased marketing access into a new market as part of those export incentives. So it really is why B is not correct. What I want to ask you, Terry, is why does increasing the size of a quota lead to more free trade? Because I feel like students often can get that quota thing a little bit the wrong way around.
Yeah, so in fact, it's something which I emphasize when I go through this with students, is that you've got to remember the quotas kind of, when it comes to the wording, it's literally the opposite. So when you increase a quota, we understand that a quota is a quantity volume that is allowed of something. So if you actually increase that quantity allowed, you're actually giving less protection because you're allowing for more imports to come in. And so, yeah, it can get really, really tricky there. But I think, yeah, you're right, Ron. I think that's what they were really looking to test, whether the students were paying attention, or were they just throwing, tariffs, quotas, and subsidies all into this one umbrella of free trade.
Definitely. So then we've got number 9. Number 9, a hypothetical economy is moved from a current account deficit to a current account surplus. Again, I think this is great because clearly very topical. So as you're saying, Terry, some of these questions clearly have really been lifted from economic activity over the last 18 months. Now, for this one, which one was correct here?
So B, a decrease in the price of imports and a depreciation of the currency.
Now, again, I think it's worth to unpack this briefly, right? Because I think looking at this, right, you might think, oh, well, see an increase in export prices, right? Although an increase in debt servicing costs
will probably offset
it, right? Exactly. Now, the reason for B, at least from my take, is, well, a decrease in the price of imports is helpful simply because it's going to, again, assuming for a moment that our exports don't significantly change, it's going to improve our BOGs. But then because the currency is depreciating, it's going to improve our international competitiveness. So we should see then exports also rise, which is a positive, right? So it particularly drives an improved BOGs performance overall. Does it have any other implications here?
Yeah, so it does in the longer term, so with the depreciation. And I do want to touch on that because with multis, I usually tell students you should assume that they're only asking about the short run. Now, when it comes to topic 2, specifically about the BOGs and the exchange rates, this does tend to get a little bit muddied because we know that things are quite cyclical in that. So that, if something happens in the short run, it's likely to be to readjust and correct itself into the long term. So I think, yeah, this one was a question that you had to be brave and kind of walk away from that assumption that we only ever talk about short run. I would say, yeah, for most questions, it always makes sense. Stick to the short run. But in this situation, yeah, the depreciation you could have brought in some J curve. Yeah, you could have brought in. You could have also thought about it from the net primary income, from the net primary income aspect. But yeah, it was. Yeah.
Cool. So we've got B. So let's keep moving. Number 10. This just shows an economy moving from X to Y on the business cycle, and you needed to identify the combination of changes that would essentially reduce GDP.
Yeah.
So I think this one was relatively simple. You know, D, a rise in taxation, you know, and a rise in the cash rate.
Yeah.
Right.
No comments.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that either. Equally for 11, right? 11 was a fairly simple CPI calculation. You know, 148. Now you're taking it on 140 the year prior, so don't make the mistake of coming back to 130 there.
Yeah.
And so that gives you B, which is 5.7.
Yeah.
Now, the next one was an interesting one. Terry, what's the
Yeah.
question and why is it interesting?
So, in a hypothetical economy, there is an increase in the marginal propensity to save, or the MPS. And so then they give you a table and they want you to show what the effects on national income and the simple multiplier are going to be. Now, it is quite interesting. So the actual correct answer is D, but there's definitely another way that you can think of this. So I'll just go through the way that they wanted first, and Rowan, you share then what could have been. So if we have a higher marginal propensity to save, we know that the multiplier is going to go down simply because people are now holding on to more of their income and they're not spending it as much, which therefore kind of slows down that multiplier cycle and effect. So therefore the multiplier is going to decrease. And then if we remember our little multiplier and change in national income formula, then we know that if the multiplier decreases, then national income should also decrease. Now that gives us D, but Rowan, there was a very, very valid case for B.
So yeah, and I'll make that case, because when I did it, I could sort of, when I was going through it, I was like, oh, I see there's going to be a B versus D playoff here.
Yeah.
And so when you think about it, right, B had simple multiplier also decreasing, but it had national income increasing. And so the way that I looked at it here was to say, well, yes, the multiplier is decreased. So maybe K went from 2 to 1.5, for example, right? You don't know, but you know, there's going to be a decrease in that multiplier, but the multiplier still exists.
Yeah.
There is still a multiplier, and so therefore national income will still technically increase, right? It'll just increase at a slower rate.
Yeah.
And I've seen in some of the past years, they have had questions relating to inflation, where they've had inflation being 2% one year, 1% the next year. And the answer has been, well, that inflation has still increased, right? Because it has, it's just increased at a slower rate. So if you had done some of those prior papers and seen some of the way in which they'd asked it, you could have easily made the assumption here, okay, technically, yes, the multiplier has decreased, but national income is still growing. Now, I think one of the things you've got to remember, though, is like ceteris paribus, right? Like, I think that's the sort of rule to really
Which, honestly, they should have probably mentioned.
Yeah, they didn't, right? And I think that's probably where I think it would have helped if they'd been clearer to say, assuming ceteris paribus, right, you would then know, well, assuming everything else remains the same, which means no new changes to aggregate demand, then you could say, well, national income would decrease, right? Which would make D the correct answer. Whereas if you're not making that assumption, there is a case to say, you know, B is also plausible.
Absolutely, yeah.
Cool, so that's an interesting one. And I imagine, again, you know, that maybe is actually a case of overthinking it. Right, I feel like if you overthink it a little bit, you probably land on B, because you go, oh, well, technically, you know, like it's actually still going to increase. Whereas if you just went for sort of the more immediate answer, you go, well, the multiplier decreases, national income decreases, simple multiplier decreases, therefore D is the correct answer. Cool. What about 13?
I really don't have much to say about this one, but the question was, which of the following statements is most correct in relation to public goods? So as long as you remembered your public good definitions, we know that it's non-rival and non-excludable. Then we'd go with C. Anyone can benefit from using public goods without paying directly for them.
So free rider behaviour. Yep, exactly. Number 14, migrant workers often send money back to their families overseas. How is this recorded on the CAD? I liked this because it's a good example where when I often am teaching, you know, the current account, like I'm spending the time going, hey, like make sure you learn the different transactions on the accounts, because often there is a multi that comes up that is trying to trick you on one of it, right? And so I think this was an example of one where they haven't done this one for a little while as well. And so migrant workers sending money overseas, well, we know first of all it's a debit. Okay, that's going to help you at least in getting you down to a primary income debit or a secondary income debit. Yeah. So 50-50 guess at that point, and then it's definitely a secondary income debit. So the answer being C. Cool. What about 15, Terry?
So which of the following is most likely to cause an increase in both the participation rate and the unemployment rate? So at first it is quite a tough.
It's a bit of Ocon's law really coming through here a little bit.
And so the correct answer is just that you're going to get an increase in the minimum wage. I think the other answers were just so kind of far off. Like B and C, for example, they were just so far off.
Yeah,
like
straight away.
Yeah, straight away knocked them out. But I think D. Now that I have a closer look at D, well, actually, no, D as well.
Well, because it would certainly lower the participation rate, right?
So like you don't really have to work on both the unemployment rate and the participation rate together at the same time.
You can just get one of them.
And that makes it a lot simpler as a question.
Just to sort of highlight it as to sort of, like a very quick explanation on the reason why though, a minimum wage, I mean, this is debatable. Data shows that minimum wages generally do create some unemployment with young people. They don't generally seem to have an impact on unemployment across the broader market. But there is an idea that by putting a minimum wage by definition is a wage that is going to be a price floor. Right, it's going to be above the equilibrium, which will create some unemployment in the market. And then secondly, linking to sort of Ocon's law, right, there's an idea that if you actually increase the minimum wage, it makes it more attractive for people to start work. And so the idea is often when that happens, more people start actively looking for work and it increases the unemployment rate, which is why you often need economic growth to be greater than your increase in the sort of the size of the labour force participation rate to offset that sort of occurring. So yeah, A is the correct answer, but you're right, you didn't need to go into that whole sort of deep, whatever, technical to get to the answer itself.
And to me, that kind of says to me that this is a bit of a poor question design. I think a good question would have thought about that, that fact that, you're asking for two things, but you're not actually...
Not required
you're not testing two things, but you're asking for it.
Yeah,
so
that's right. Great. Now, this was one I think that probably, question 16, I think probably stymied a fair few students potentially as well.
Let me tell you, like, the teaching community has just gone absolutely nuts on this one. It was fascinating. Like,
that's a good question. I actually quite liked it.
You know that Michael Jackson gif where he's just eating the popcorn? That was literally me. I mean, I got it, but I was just watching everybody else just kind of...
So the question is, a new tollway eliminates 24 sets of traffic lights. Which of the following is not an externality as a result of the new tollway? And so I think what we've got to think about here, first of all, is just very briefly, before we unpack the answer, like, what's an externality, right? And so an externality at its base is a byproduct of economic activity. Now, this could be a positive, it could be a negative. And I can see why then this gets challenging, because byproduct is quite a vague, like, what is a byproduct, right? There is a whole lot of things that you could argue, clearly in this question, is a byproduct of economic activity.
And if I share just what some of my colleagues were saying, actually, they started to get a little bit more specific with the way they were defining externality, when in actual fact, I think keeping it nice and vague was actually what really helped me. Because I'm interested, because Rowan and I, we actually haven't discussed how we both got to this answer. So I'm interested to see, how I
got to it.
If you don't mind, I'll start first.
Go for it.
And I kept it really, really simple. And in the end, it worked. So, like, as I said at the start of the video, keep it simple. It really is a game of not trying to overcook and overthink. And so I just went with, an externality is, we're talking about something which is a byproduct or an unintended effect. So then if the question's asking for something that's not an externality, then I just kind of reversed that and said, well, what was the intended effect? And for me, obviously, more noise pollution, unless you've got, Satan as your government. You're not trying to actively create more noise pollution. B, you're also not trying to create more traffic on local. That's not your intention of building this new tollway. And C, it depends who you ask.
Depends what council, right? What local council you're working at.
Depends how active the ICAC is. But look. Let's just, for argument's sake, let's just say they're also not intending to increase the value of nearby. And what was their intention? Well, very clearly we could see that if, and it's even alluded to in the question, that it eliminates, 24 sets of traffic lights. That can only, for me, be talking about decreasing travel time for users, which is the intention and therefore not an externality.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think that's a great way to look at it in terms of thinking about it. I think the way that I sort of looked at it was that generally speaking, the way that I've sort of approached externalities, and I think the way it's taught, is that when you think of an externality, usually it's either environmental or economic.
Yeah.
Right? So usually the positive externalities are economic. Usually the negative externalities are environmental, right? And so the way I looked at it was I was like, great, okay, like let's go through each of these. More noise pollution, environmental, right? Traffic on local streets. Well, there's an idea right there that sometimes may be like a positive if it's bringing economic activity to those local streets, which is often the example given with like, new trucking lines going out to local areas. So I was like, oh, you could probably argue that there is maybe some local economic benefits that are unintended for like local corner stores and like local shopping centers.
Yeah.
Maybe a stretch, but possible, right?
But then that would make it not, like the question is asking about not.
Right.
So that would very clearly put it out of being.
That's right. Yeah. Exactly it, right? And then increased value. Well, for me, it was like, I could see where some people might have selected that actually.
I think I had a lot of kids that went with this one.
That went with C, right? Because they're like, and I think the key here is, well, one for me, it's like economic, right? Like clearly. There is a byproduct here.
Yeah.
It is unintended.
Yeah.
Well, as we said, jokingly, maybe sometimes intended, but in theory it should be unintended, right?
I hope we don't get sued, right?
Yeah, I know. In theory it should be unintended, and it's economic, right? So that's where I went. Yeah, I don't think it's C. I'm left with D, and I'm like, well, D is not really environmental or economic. Again, you could argue, well, less travel time for users means they've got more productive, more leisure time, less impact on the health system, whatever, right? But again, it's too many steps removed. And so I just went, okay, my gut told me D seems to be the one that is just not, right? Because of the way, the frame that I used with environmental and economic.
Yeah.
Cool.
But I'm glad we both got there. Now, I want to highlight, like, literally, I've heard cases for every single answer for that question.
Yeah.
And this is from, like, teachers who are very, very experienced. So if you didn't get that one, please don't feel bad.
I think that's a tough one.
I think it's the toughest of this paper.
Also, I think, to be fair, the reason I also think it's very tough is that my experience with the way externalities is taught, whether or not it's the textbook or otherwise, right, is that you're generally given two examples.
Yeah.
Right? You're generally, given an example of, like pollution byproduct environmentally.
It's the car. No, it's always the car.
Yeah.
Driving a car. It's always that.
Yeah, right? Or, it's, the idea of like there's exactly like the new tollway, for example, a new freeway, but it's then like the economic activity for the sort of truck stop alongside the road and the employment and so forth, right? And so usually, as I said, it falls into those two categories. And so I can see why for a lot of people this was like, what? Like, where the hell is this, either increased value of land or travel time sort of coming from, given the typical examples that you've seen prior to this? Let's keep moving. Yeah. 17.
It gave us a bunch of data about the labour force, and I think all you had to do was just make some calculations comparing year 1 to year 2.
That's right. And you had to know what not to look at here, which is usually what they try to do with these style. So what should you not have looked at here that was actually not relevant?
Wait, no.
On the spot. So part-time employee, just to help out, right?
No, wait. Really?
So,
yeah.
You don't actually, because
my bad,
right? I mean, this is exactly it. You look at it and you're like, oh, wait, am I
because I was looking for like to add it to full time, and I realized
but there's no full time.
Yeah,
which is often what they will do sometimes, right?
Yeah.
So like literally here, you needed to go unemployed over labour force is how we're going to get our unemployment rate. So it goes from 18.3 to 16%. And then you get your labour force over your working age population. It goes from 54 to 55. So we can therefore say A is right, unemployment decreases while participation increases.
Look, in my defence, Rowan, I could have gone and calculated full-time employment. I think that's what my brain was kind of...
Well, you could have worked that out. Yeah, exactly, right? But you just didn't need to in this question.
I haven't looked at this for a while, so that's where I went.
Cool, we got another calc one in 18,
Yeah.
just getting you to make sure that you are doing the calculations correctly for the BOP. Now, the trick for this one is you've got to put a minus sign in front of the imports. But this is a pretty standard one, right? Like you see this all the time. They always do this. They always don't give you the minus sign for the imports, but give you the minus for the net primary income, net secondary income. And they're just trying to like catch you off guard.
Yeah. And I think the other trick is that they also had the capital count in
That's
negative
true,
position.
and they don't always do that. Yeah,
often.
I mean negative, yeah.
But
so
it is relevant for us now.
Yeah, it is,
But
right?
it's just,
And that's exactly it. And to be fair, that I had to do a second check on that because I was like, oh yeah, wait a minute though, you need the CAFA to be in the positive technically because the current account was a deficit. And so, okay, yup. And so there was a moment where it was like, I double checked.
Yeah.
So what's the correct answer then?
D.
Yup, so we've got Boggs being positive 15 because minus 110 plus 125 is 15.
Yep.
And then the overall current account was negative 35, so the CAFA needs to be positive 35, so we therefore get our 80 there. Great, 19. What was the question and what's the solution here?
Okay, so you've got a hypothetical economy under a managed exchange rate. The exchange rate is to be maintained between 60 to 70 USD. 60 to 70 US cents, I should say. There has been an increase in demand for the domestic currency, leading to its value moving outside the central bank's range. How should the central bank intervene to move the exchange rate towards its range? So
I think the first point here is you got to just make sure to get this right, you've got to realize, well, if there was an increase in demand for the domestic currency, it's appreciated.
Yeah.
So it's moved outside of the range above, and so we're needing to find a way to bring it
back
down. Yeah, exactly. I think if you didn't get that right,
that already gives you a 50-50 because
exactly.
then you knock out the ones, you knock out A and C, which say they appreciate, and
Yep.
then after that it's really just about thinking what's actually going to depreciate the currency, and that was B.
That's right.
By decreasing the cash rate to reduce demand for the currency.
Yep, because that creates most likely a negative interest rate differential, or at least it worsens the interest rate differential. Definitely. Great. And then for 20, we had some nominal GDP and we had some CPI, and we needed to basically calculate. There was two calculation steps here. You needed to first calculate the real figure, and then you needed to calculate the change in that real figure. Now, when I did this, I had to do it twice. Simply because the first step is you take 300, the nominal, divided by your CPI, so 125 times it by 100, and then you do the same for year two. Now, when I did it, what I didn't use when I then calculated the change was I didn't use to the two decimal places. And so I actually got a figure that was like 10.51% because I had just used rounded figures. And that caused me to go, oh, did I get this wrong? When you actually used to the two decimal places, you got 10.4%, which we see.
Yeah, and I think for me, like these ones here, like I'm always curious to see how they got the other answers. And so as you were just going through, I noticed that with if you'd just done the nominal, like year three minus year two, and you did 50, like 300 minus 250 to get 50, divide that by the 250, you actually would have got D, 20%. So I can see, and that's always something they do, like to do for multis. Like they'll give you an answer that was
plausibly,
through an incorrect method of work,
right.
but still would have been an answer. And that, then when that happens, you walk away.
You
got
I
got the answer because you guys know about that. When you do an answer, you do a maths question and none of the answers match up with what you got. So it makes you feel good.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Right. But then it could lull you into a false sense of confidence.
Exactly right.
Great. So that's the multis, guys. Hopefully that helps you go through in your own mind what you put down and maybe calculate how you went, of course, before the official results become live. What we're now going to do is we're not going to cover all the shorts, simply because there's a lot in there, and some of them are fairly straightforward, right? We think that, they've been done so many times before in other HSCs or trials that there's answers floating around.
Or they're just pretty basic.
Yeah, that's right. So what we're going to do is more by exception. What are some here that we think are a little interesting? Share a couple of things that you probably should have put in your answer. And then we'll quickly also highlight a couple of things for some of the essays as well. So jumping into question 21, I think the interesting one here was B, distinguish between trading blocks and monetary unions. What's your thoughts, Terry? I think this is one that a lot of students, I think, probably would have struggled with a little bit. How do you view some of the differences between these? I mean, it's a two-marker as well, right? So
for a two-marker, I think you've just got to make, if you really just want to get at least just one really clear, solid difference. And so I think, recognition that with the monetary union that they've got the same currency, I think that would have been the first one I would have went to. You can also bring in the central bank and things like that as well. But I think it's nice and easy. I think the confusion comes from the fact that a lot of people study only one main trading block and only one monetary union. And then they never really separate the two actual...
and they're often the same. Right? Exactly, right?
Yeah, so they don't really learn the difference. So then when it gets to the day, they'll write about the EU, but then they might just be guessing. What's the difference?
So I think hopefully you picked up the marks for that, at least saying, well, yes, there's a central currency, there's maybe you even went as far as to say there's a central bank. hopefully, I mean, I think that was, if you had both of those, slam dunk, right? If you got one of them and you would at least somehow articulated that a trading block doesn't, and you probably still would have got the two, but depending on how hard they're wanting to be. Now, question 21C, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but this was something I noticed that I think was in a trial. Was it in the Catholic?
Rowan, I'm not the guy to ask.
Yeah. Which was at least a trend towards a case study style question that was trying to get students to focus more on economic development rather than, policies for economic growth and development, which is usually how it's articulated. And if we're being really honest, most of the policies, tend to be more growth focused than they are development focused. Now, it's not to say that you can't make them development focused, because obviously growth and development are fairly intertwined. But my observation, I'm pretty certain it was from the trial, and I think it was the Catholic or maybe the Independent, but it was this year. I saw a lot of students drop marks on this in the trial because they put in policies that they hadn't sufficiently connected to economic development. So let's just use China here for a moment, because most students do China, or at least familiar with it because of its relationship with Australia. What would be a couple of the policies you could have referenced more specifically to economic development here?
So for me personally, I usually always go straight for the environment. So I talk about the fact that they're in the Paris Agreement. I talk about their 5-year plans in terms of how they're going to reduce pollution. I also like to bring in the HDI. I think it would be very important for any country really, because what they're asking you to do, I want to pay close attention, is the evaluate verb. And it's very difficult to actually make a proper evaluation or judgment without actually
without some data, right?
Without some data to back your point up. So I'd go for the environment. The other thing I'd talk about is the income inequality between the regions.
Definitely.
That's
massive.
But then I think a lot of students, when they study China, they focus on the narrative of how it came to be. There's not as much actual policy of what they're doing to address that.
And is it working? I think the other one, if it was China, for example, that you could talk about here, because it's actually the policy they're trying to do to address inequality is like One Belt, One Road, right? There's strategic other factors of why they're doing it, but it's also investing along West and East. It's like Weet-Bix. I have to go through my little, it's embarrassing, I know, I'm so bad with directions. But anyway, south and west is actually the correct answer, because east is where all the wealth sits because of the special economic trading zones. And so by using One Belt, One Road, essentially they're building infrastructure across the west and the south to essentially try to deal with some of that disparity. So it's just, again, it's an example of one that you could have put in there as part of your evaluation.
I think just to finish up on that, I think a lot of students will walk away writing probably quite on a growth focus. And I think that ultimately, because I'm here to be realistic with you guys, I think that is probably going to possibly hurt you a little bit if you don't do a good job of linking. Rowan, just very quickly, was there something they maybe could have done to link, if they were very growth focused, is there anything they could have done to maybe connect it to development a little bit?
So let's just go with a really typical, that every essay I read on China will have, special economic zones, right? Of course, it's important. Now, I think the way that you could have potentially connected that to economic development is linking it through the investment into infrastructure in the eastern ports, right? And then linking it in particular then to the significant impact it had on the HDI for, eastern populations along China, and then contrasting it with the consequence in the regional inequality that created. And so I think, again, you would have had to take a policy and instead of talking about trade, which is often where it's, and maybe focusing only on the growth in FDIs, you need to then link it more clearly into, as you highlighted, the HDI, right? Because that's one of the clear measures that we use when we look at economic development. Cool. So then just quickly, this is not a hard one, I just want to frame question 22. You had one market-based policy affecting environmental sustainability. I mean, you could have gone with a carbon emission trading scheme here. You could have gone with the emission reduction fund and subsidies as examples. They want you to support your answer with an example. So you really would have, trading scheme or subsidy needed to use one of those policy examples.
The only thing I want to add to that is, they actually mentioned Australia. So, unfortunately, you can't really do anything that's overseas if you had something from overseas.
Now, in both of those examples, the good news is that, have existed at some point in Australia. Probably, to be honest, the easiest one you had there was honestly the emission reduction fund, right? Like it's Australian and it's still current, and it's not that difficult to explain succinctly. Whereas a trading scheme is a little more complex. And I find that students often get a little lost along the way.
And it's always like, come back to this, like just go with what's going to get you the marks. You don't have to show off the most complex stuff.
Particularly with time constraints at play. So let's keep moving. I think the next one was maybe question 23. Explain the effects of low inflation on the Australian economy. Again, I think not an incredibly difficult one, but one that I wonder if maybe some students didn't quite do all the way to get the 4 marks. Right? It's just a gut feel that I had. What are some of the things that come to mind for you, Terry?
So first of all, straight away looking at it, I know I'm being a bit of a semanticist here, if that's a word, but it is a thing in marking where if it says to explain the effects, there is an expectation that you're going to go beyond just one effect. So even if you do one effect and you do a brilliant job explaining it, they're not going to see sufficient comprehensiveness there to give you a 4 out of 4.
So you're needing 2 at a minimum, really, right? I mean, if you can somehow squeeze in a 3rd, you're giving it a 4 marker, you're really just playing it safe, right? So
absolutely.
Think about how many effects did you put in this?
My other point really is just that I think a lot of what you look at, I think probably it's becoming less of an issue because low inflation has, we're a bit outdated, but low inflation was such a persistent issue for a number of years.
But the whole secular stagnation period. Certainly.
And so, but before that, like I think the textbooks didn't have a huge focus on just explaining effects of inflation when it's low.
That's right. It's usually effects of high inflation. That's
so
exactly
I think it might have been a little bit of a struggle to try and get some there if that wasn't part of your teaching.
That's right. So, let's just quickly unpack maybe together 3 effects, right? So, I look at it and I think, well, great. One of the effects of low inflation is low wage growth.
Absolutely,
Right? And then, low wage growth means lower consumption levels simply because wages are the single most important determinant of consumption in the economy. And so therefore, if we've got lower consumption levels, we've then clearly got just lower levels of economic growth. So we've got like one sort of solid effect that we've sort of mapped out there. What else? What's another one that we could have talked about?
For me, I'm a big fan of diversity. So I do love to bring just a different range of stuff so that the marker can clearly see that I have that comprehensive understanding. So for me, I would have gone with international competitiveness.
Great, yes. So without a doubt as well, definitely. So you're going to see, precisely right. Lower inflation is going to improve your international competitiveness. So it's a real positive here. Great. So and this is where you could have put a negative, you could have put a positive in. Any other effects that we could sort of highlight here of low inflation on the Australian economy? Perhaps one thing that you could argue here is what's the effect of low inflation on the dollar? Does it do a lot?
Oh, the Australian dollar?
Yeah.
It's also probably possibly going to give us a bit of a better position, just simply because we're not losing as much purchasing power, and so it might also help with foreign demand when they, as I said, with the exports becoming more internationally competitive. It might also then give us a bit of an appreciation.
So there's a bunch of things you could play out, right? So I think hopefully that's helped you get a sense of like, okay, great, we've got a couple of things here we could use.
But I think for next year, if you are watching this and you're doing the HSC next year, these are the types of questions where you have to be brave and you have to just go for it. Don't shy away and just only talk about the 1 or 2 things you're confident with. You've got to go for it.
Yeah, and I think that's it. I think often it can be an equation of even just trying to articulate. Like, I think when you're here and you get stuck, it's like, great, just try to walk through it, right? Just try to create the links, okay? Like, all right, well, low inflation, what are the things that I can apply it to? Like, okay, because I think definitely, right? Like, 2 simple ways here is, okay, well, low inflation, you think wages, and then you also think cost of goods, right? And then from there, you can sort of just go from it, right? Exactly. Question 23 also then had, how can micro policies reduce the Nauru? Now, I don't think this was, again, incredibly difficult. I think it's just useful to go, okay, when we think about the Nauru, we're thinking about, structural, certainly, yes, we've got, some frictional, we've got some sort of, seasonal hardcore, etc. But the main one is structural. The main one that accessibility for policy here is structural. And so then what you're needing to look at is, again, an Australian example. And I actually wonder if that's maybe where, again, it shouldn't be hard, but I wonder if that's where some students might have got a little lost.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think on its own, without the Australian example, it's a pretty standard question that's been done quite a few times. I think this is one of the few times where I have seen them explicitly asking for an Australian example. And
this paper itself, actually, I felt
had a lot.
Precisely. A lot more than normal. And I mean, I think that's great because one of the things I've often seen is students often ask, in classes like, do we need to have examples in the short answers? And often my answer has been, well, not necessarily, because often, you don't have the words to put one in, right? It depends on the marks. And so I've often said, look, you've got to be, you've got to try to play it by ear, right? You've got to look at it and go, okay, is it a longer mark one, which you can see that an example is going to really bolster your answer and you've got it. If it's a shorter mark one, it's probably you just stick to the theory and you get your marks out. Yeah. This paper was interesting in that they essentially were telling you, use examples.
And I really hope they continue with that because it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be down to students whether they can pick up and learn to play by ear. I think if they want something, be explicit and ask for it.
That's right. Yeah. I agree. And so I think that's great. I think that's been a good sort of theme here. So I mean, look, an Australian example is anything that is aimed to reduce structural unemployment. So really, I mean, significant amounts of recent fiscal policy with the labour market would go to this, right? So you could talk about things like, job maker. You could talk about apprenticeship programs, right? You could talk about, any of the education sort of spending, and there's been significant amounts of it. So there was plenty of recent examples in fiscal policy.
And even if you didn't want to go recent, you could have gone with something a little bit more old school, and that would have been okay as well.
Yeah, that's right. So we're going to skip a couple because I think some of the ones are fairly straightforward.
Yeah.
And let's just talk briefly then about the essays to just sort of bring us home here. And so we've got question 25, which was evaluate the effectiveness of Australia's fiscal policy in managing unemployment, income distribution, and external stability. Yep. I think an interesting pairing. Again, I understand why they've picked those. Obviously, very topical, but typically not paired together in a lot of prior questions. Again, that's a theme that we're seeing though, right? Yeah. What are your thoughts, Terry? Did you have any thoughts on what students should have really needed to do here?
I think if they just really stuck to what the question was asking, there was enough in there, because I think asking for 3 different objectives is actually quite a lot to get through. So I think as long as they stuck with they stuck with exactly what was being asked, and then they actually gave an evaluation. So I think there is a difference between giving an analysis or giving an explanation or giving even a discussion versus an evaluation.
And structurally, right, I mean, you could have kept it pretty simple here. You could have just done it by issue,
objective,
right? Exactly, like unemployment, income distribution, external stability. With the evaluation, what I would have recommended, if you could here, is that yes, you would have spent a little bit more time looking at more of the recent years. So I probably would have focused on maybe the last 3 budgets. Now, ideally, what I think would have helped is potentially if you had examples, you could have compared and contrasted.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe if you were going even further back with a post-GFC budget as a quick comparative, okay, particularly with external stability, right? That would have been, I think, really nailing it from a point of being able to show an evaluation a little bit more, as a compare and contrast by referencing, different points in time under those objectives.
Yeah, especially if one period was effective and one period was ineffective, then that just takes you home.
Precisely right. And that's exactly, I think, what a better response I think would have done. Because I imagine, my observation is most students picked this question.
I agree,
certainly from the conversations I've had with students, right? Yeah. And so again, then it's like, okay, if you really wanted to differentiate yourself, given that so many students picked this and there was, I guess, high levels of competition relative, I think that's one of the things that would have helped. Let's look at question 26, which was monetary policy. Evaluate the effectiveness of monetary policy in managing growth, income distribution, and external stability. So it's interesting, right? You've got income distribution, external stability appearing in both options, so you can't really
run.
you gotta do it. Now, this one was a little interesting, and I think I can see why a lot of students might have shied away from this one a little more, because monetary policy and external stability are not 2 things that you often unpack and spend a lot of time. Like clearly monetary and economic growth, monetary an income distribution often because of the unintended side effects of monetary policy.
Yeah.
So again, I could see why a lot of students would have gone, oh crap, I don't really know what I want to say here.
Yeah. With that external stability point, I think it's interesting because if you go back, way back, then there's stuff you can say. When monetary policy, when external stability was a big concern in Australia, that's when they actually did think about using monetary policy, making changes there. So, but it's not really something which we cover.
Yeah,
right. And so I think to throw it in there was a bit of a tough one.
Yeah. I think it really gets students to have to think on their feet a lot more, doesn't it?
Yeah. And I think it'd be more targeted towards students who've done a lot of preparation.
Yeah. So I know the couple of students I know that did monetary were ones that like they knew their monetary like back to front, right?
But I think the good side of this one was that they gave you economic growth. And I think that's always there's always more to say for economic growth than the other one, which was full employment. Yeah. So I think it was give and take. Yeah. Right.
They made it a little hard for you with one of them, but they sort of threw you like a
a bone.
Yeah, exactly, right? Now, what I would say is, again, you could have really done this structurally, right? You could have done this by issue.
Yeah.
Now, of course, you could also do it by time period and have an integrated approach where you're looking at like, I'm going to look at like, maybe exactly like going back and doing like GFC, maybe doing like a, mining boom, a secular stag. Like you could do it either way. I think simplicity's sake, it's sort of the question lent itself to doing it by issue and then doing a bit of a compare and contrast within.
Yeah.
Now, what I would say, I'm not going to talk really about the economic growth one because I think that's relatively easy. Hopefully, if you did income distribution, what you are highlighting is the conflict that can often occur in the fact that if we think about it, right, increasing the cash rate, right, can often have negative consequences.
I also don't like this because you could, if you were talking about recent stuff, I think there's more to be said about wealth distribution and housing asset prices.
Income, right?
Yeah, so I really didn't like that they completely took it away. Yeah.
And I think some students probably would have snuck a bit of wealth in there anyway. I know some of the students that I spoke to, particularly because of the asset price effect in terms of one of the transmission channels, right, did talk about it. And so, I think I often see, and I don't know what your position is on this, Terry, like I often see that when income distribution is referenced, I often wonder if they're actually just using it
as a
like all-encompassing to sort of say, well, talk about a bit of wealth as well. Now, I hope that's the case because I think, again, for students that might have mentioned a little bit of wealth in there, but if it's again, if you're being was it a semanticist?
Yeah.
Was it? If you're being a semanticist, right, you would argue, well, no, wealth was not relevant here.
Yeah, that's my stance. But you know what? Feel free to go against my stance. Yeah, it wouldn't be the first time anyway.
So I think that's for income. You want to be highlighting that there is some conflicts that are really going to play out there. Okay, and that changes in the cash rate often disproportionately impact lower income earners because they're generally net borrowers.
Yeah.
So increased cash rates hurt them more. Right, and they often end up having to draw upon savings a lot more. What about external stability, right? Because I think that's the one for students that if they did this, they're probably a little nervous about how they handled it.
Yeah, so I think the best way to approach this for both the fiscal and the monetary would have been to talk about just the highly expansionary stance that we've taken on both and seeing how that impacts our net external positions in terms of the level of debt that we have and therefore the level of repayments we have to make. So I think with monetary, it would have been nice just to talk about the fact that since the cash rate is so low at the moment, it will actually assist us in terms of maintaining that stability despite the record jumps in debt.
And I think there's a couple other little things you could tease out from this as well.
I think exchange rates as well.
Yep, definitely. I think on top of that, at a base level, like just super simplistic, contractionary macro policy in the short term improves external stability, right? Simply because of the fact that it reduces consumption and imports, and it's the quickest way if you're trying to, particularly if you've got a cab that's the driver of, poor external stability, right? So at a real simple level, you could have just hit with that, right? And that is something that gets taught, right? Maybe not specifically to monetary, but certainly around the fact that, a constraint, external stability is a constraint to economic growth because of the need for contractionary macro policy.
So just touching on that very quickly, I think it's very important that moving forward, because I think these exams, they're not getting harder, but I think what they're doing is they are stressing more of an emphasis on synthesis for their own student. This isn't, I really don't, if you're watching this and you're thinking next year, I want to rote learn this course, please, I highly advise you don't. If you really take the time to digest and synthesize, number one, I think it's more enjoyable, but number two, more importantly, I think you're actually going to do a lot better. in actually.
And I think that's exactly, it's a great example of like, you could have taken what you learned in external stability around contractionary macro and then applied it into monetary here, right? Now, the other thing to just note is you might have even, but more so to a point of like, potentially, and this is only if you had the words and the time, like QE has involved the government, I should say the RBA buying second hand, right? And so I think there's just an interesting thing there. One, because Terry, you mentioned around, the fact that our debt's got more sustainable because of the servicing costs. I think even just a throwaway comment that sort of just draws the distinction that QE was not directly funding, right? I think is again an example of something that just, again, is something that might take you a little bit further above your peers because you're just drawing that distinction and highlighting, like, hey, yeah, I know what I'm talking about here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool, let's quick...
Can I just have one more comment?
Yeah,
just on both of the 25 and 26. Now, I think, Rowan, you mentioned the structure earlier, and I think I wholeheartedly agree. Now, one other question I think students might have had is, did you have to talk about them in the same level of depth, like for each objective?
Good point.
Absolutely not.
No, I agree.
I think, I've just going to be very careful how I word this. Absolutely not. You didn't have to talk about them all in the same level
I think
of detail.
past HSCs indicate that as well, right? If you look at marking criteria.
Yeah. It's really just because I don't think it's a reasonable expectation. It's not a reasonable,
unreasonable expectation.
Yeah, to expect.
Yeah, to talk the same amount on external stability for monetary policy, for example, as economic growth.
Yeah,
you got to be kidding.
Yeah, yeah. So if you're watching this and you're wondering, am I screwed because I didn't? No, you're not screwed. You're fine.
No,
you're
as
fine.
long as you addressed what you could have.
Yeah.
You're okay, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, really great point, Terry. So if we go into question 27, we've got assess the effects over the last 10 years.
This is the first time I've seen this.
Of free trade agreements and protectionist policies on the global economy. Now, I agree. What's interesting for me about this question is it's not on the Australian economy. Like usually they ask you, assess the impacts of, changes in global free trade and protection on Australia.
Yeah.
What they've done here, quite interestingly, and I can see why if we think about, in recent years, whether or not it's, US, China, Australia, China, there's been a lot going on, Brexit. And so I can see why they're doing it, but definitely it was an interesting spin on what is, again, a fairly common question that has appeared over the years. Any comments or thoughts on your end on how students should handle this?
I think you would have definitely had to have just tried to think about whatever you could in terms of free trade agreements and protectionist policy. What I do like is that it gave a lot of scope. Like they were real, and also by opening it up to the global economy. On one hand, while Rowan, you've mentioned that it does make things a little bit more difficult because it's just not what students are used to.
Expecting, yeah.
But on the other hand, if you were able to pivot from that, you could have really benefited because it really opened up the opportunity to talk about anything. And if you were really, really stuck, you could have just brought your case study in. Yeah.
And you certainly used it as an example. Yeah. That's right. I agree. So I mean, look, my take on it is 10 years, right? You sort of course, 2010s, right? Yeah. And one of the ways I would have looked at it is to go, great, there's been a lot, so like bilateral and multilateral, to go, okay, great, what's been happening with bilateral? And clearly there's been major growth in bilateral trade agreements, really. And so you could have then really looked at, honestly, a number of Australian examples, right? Yes, even though it's saying global economy, right, you're linking it to the fact that it's part of a broader trend. Because what other free trade agreements can you talk about? You generally only know in depth Australian free trade agreements.
And it's not like we're not part of the global economy.
Exactly. So I would have very much gone great. Australia, China was signed in this time. We've signed a number of others during the period. And then when you start getting to more multilateral, you've got, Australia, New Zealand, ASEAN. You've got a couple of really interesting multilaterals there. And then, of course, as we've talked about, you've then got Brexit. You've got US-China trade war. You've got Australia-China trade issues and WTO sort of having to step in. There's enough there that I think you can say a fair bit.
Yeah. I just got another comment about that whole last 10 years part. I think that's very interesting to see because...
They've specified it.
Yeah, basically what that means is that if you've talked about stuff that weren't in the past 10 years, you're probably not going to get rewarded for it. And from a teacher's point of view, I find that very interesting because I can definitely say that there's a lot of teachers who are going to have to update their notes over the next couple of years because it's to specify. I think it's a pretty
because usually they just say like
in
recently or something to that effect, right? And then even though generally my advice to students is think last 10 years, right? technically, there's the whole idea in economics that the long term is when you're dead, right? Horrible economics joke, if you even want to call it that. And so therefore, recent times is quite a vague idea, right? It's quite flexible. And so I actually liked it. And I would say this is a trend in this paper. One, specifying Australian examples and short answers. Two, specifying time periods. At least in the short answers and the essays, there's been a higher level of specificity in the question.
Absolutely.
And I think that's not like a new trend. We've been seeing that, certainly maybe not specifying time periods, but starting to get more precise question areas.
And another trend which I do want to point out as well is the fact that is the verbs that they're using. Like both, section 3 and section 4, we're essentially asking students to make judgments.
It's higher order.
Yeah, very high order stuff. And at the end of the day, what it means for you as a student is that you've got to actually think about what you're learning. It's not this is not a subject where you can just get away with just knowing the base theory anymore. You've actually got to have
and just
opinions.
Retelling, right? And regurgitating.
Narrative. Narrative. It's not really a narrative-based subject anymore, which is why it's really important to consume a lot of media where people do. I think I've heard of this show where there's two guys who sit down and actually do talk about and evaluate the economy. Yeah. I don't know. I forgot what it was called.
I can't remember either.
But it's definitely pitching at a much higher level, and I think in some ways that's good for a really, really high performing students, but for other students who might not necessarily,
a little bit more.
Who aren't necessarily used to that, I think it's just important that you get a bit of practice in that.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of really trying to get you to think more, right? Which, even though this is not a new syllabus, I would say that the theme of the new syllabus when it was introduced was also designed around that. And you can sort of see that even though the syllabus hasn't changed, the way in which they're trying to examine is shifting a little. Now, let's just wrap up on this final question, the final essay, question number 28. Assess the effects, again, over the last 10 years, they've not discriminated here, of changes in the global economy on Australia's trade and financial flows. Now, I think this is a little bit more of a typical question. I've seen variations of this before. My sense is more students may have chosen this one, but actually, now that I reflect, I know a lot of students did question 27 because they got sucked in by free trade agreements and then discovered they had to talk about the global economy. So I think for this one though, my gut is structurally, there's a couple of different ways that you could approach it. You could either look at trade and financial, like simply just split it that way, right? Go trade and financial flows, look at changes. You could look at just actually more of a chronological approach, looking at some of the periods that you might look in sort of, the sort of broader economy. Any other ways I could have structured it?
I had a third way, and the way when I read this question, I thought it was basically just a balance payments question. That could have been reappropriated.
Exactly it.
So but just focusing just
on
more
trade
on
and financial,
and the more cyclical stuff. So I thought doing it that way, and then just removing the fact that you're calling it a BOGS or an NDY and just sticking to trade and financial.
Which is sort of really like version 1, like trade and financial, but you're thinking about it through the lens of, and I think good students would have done that way, hopefully. Anything else you want to say on that question?
I think overall, just for section 4 in general, I think the key for me is how well you're going to do is going to also come down to just how well you can make those assessments. And so if this is something which you've worked on throughout the year, then you should hopefully have done pretty well. If not, it's not to despair, because I think a lot of these judgments aren't necessarily super difficult, but they just need to be said.
And I think what's going to highlight, if you're sort of trying to reflect on, I did one of these, how did I go? I think what's interesting about this is obviously it's not stimulus based. They haven't given you data. And so to really be able to analyze some of the effects, right? Again, Terry and I talked about this earlier in the video, having evidence, right? Having statistics and examples, right, is going to go a long way. And so I think certainly for question 28, right? Like if you didn't have a number of examples of different data points on Australia's trade figures and financial flows, right? It's going to be hard.
And also just it's like, Rowan, I know you're a soccer player. You don't want to just set the goal up, but you've got to also tap it in as well. So you got to have this, you do the hard stuff, which is getting the nice stats and putting the data points in. But I think you've got to also just finish it off, and just by making those really explicit assessments. Was this a significant impact? Was it a limited impact? Was it a positive? Was it a negative? It sounds super obvious, but I think I've said this. You need to actually state it.
Yeah, exactly. Because unfortunately, markers, they're marking a lot of papers,
Yeah.
right? They're marking one after the other. You sort of need to make it a little easy for them to see that you have made that. What you don't want to have is you don't want to have a marker going digging in your response.
And at the same time, that's not the marker's job. The marker is simply just there to mark what's on the paper. They're not supposed to try to infer certain things from what you've said. They are just here to mark what's there. So please say the obvious, even if it's obvious.
That's right. Brilliant. So there we have it, guys. That is our sort of review of the answers for the 2021 HSC Economics Exam. Hopefully you've sort of watched this and you're sort of feeling a lot better because you're like, great, I did a lot of what the guys talked about. I've nailed it. Unfortunately, if all this has done is make you more anxious because you're realizing that maybe you did something different, I don't think we can help, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, what I can say is they're going to be nice. They'll be nicer than us.
Yeah, and what I would say is, if you're sitting there feeling that way, know that there's a lot of other students that have also watched and probably sat there and thought, oh crap, I did the same things. So you're not alone.
Yeah.
I think certainly like some of these parts were a little trickier and challenging, and a lot of students.
And actually, if it is a more tricky paper, which I think now that we've taken a look at it, there's definitely, it's not necessarily tricky in that it's going out of its way to trick you, but it's complex. There is complexity in it. To
really get like the marks, right? I think this is a sort of paper that I viewed as a little deceiving actually, in that on the face of it, it doesn't look that hard. Right? But then as you dig in and you go, oh, actually, to get the full marks here, you know what, there's some things you're going to have to do that are a little tricky than you might have realized.
And on that note, really, if a lot of people aren't going to do those things, then what the general standards procedure is that they will adjust their expectations because, every year how it works, to not go into a long discussion, but they look at what a Band 6 student should be able to do. And, at the end of the day, maybe like a Band 6 student wouldn't be able to do everything in here, and that's fine. So and then they just scale it based on that. They adjust it back down.
That's right. Brilliant, guys. So if you have any questions about the exam, let us know in the comments below. Maybe you've got like a really strong opinion about one of the questions that you think for some reason Terry and I were just entirely off our rockers about. Let us know in the comments below as well what that might be. And of course, if you haven't already, hit subscribe.
See you next year.
See you next year. Well, that was long, but covered a lot. How long was that?